There's a number I want you to think about. If you contributed the maximum to the Canada Pension Plan for 35 years and you passed away just 1 year into retirement, your family would receive almost none of that money. Not because it was lost, not because of a market crash, because of how the system was actually designed. Today I want to walk you through what is changing with CPP in 2026, not just the official summary, the part most people never hear, because there are really two stories here. There's the government's version, adjustments, percentages, acronyms, and then there's the version that affects your actual life. Let's start with what ended on December 31st, 2025. Since 2019, Canada has been in a quiet but significant transition. The CPP was being gradually enhanced. The goal was to move from replacing 1/4 of your average earnings to replacing closer to 1/3. That enhancement phase is now complete. It is over. And that matters, but not equally for everyone. If you retired before 2019, your CPP benefit does not change in any meaningful way. You'll receive a 2% adjustment this year, tied to the official inflation rate. But if you're still working, say retiring around 2028 or 2030, the picture is more complicated. You've been paying higher contribution rates throughout this enhancement period. You've been contributing into CPP2 if your income exceeded approximately $74,600. But here's what most people don't fully realize. The benefit you'll receive when you retire reflects only the years you contributed at the enhanced rate. If you have 5 or 6 years left of work, you'll see a modest improvement, perhaps a few $100s per year, at retirement. Not nothing, but not transformative either. The people who benefit most from this enhancement are those just entering the workforce today. Someone graduating this spring, contributing at the new rates for 40 years, could see their CPP benefit roughly 50% higher than what someone retiring today receives. That is a meaningful, long-term improvement. But it is very much a generational gain, not an immediate one. Now, let's talk about the 2% adjustment, because this number deserves more scrutiny. The official inflation rate came down. The Bank of Canada says things are stabilizing, so the annual CPP adjustment is 2%. And I understand the formula. But when I look at what most Canadians actually spend money on, groceries, rent, utilities, medication, property taxes, I have a hard time connecting those real costs to a 2% figure. The people most affected aren't comparing spreadsheets. They're standing at a checkout counter, watching a cart of groceries cost 30% more than it did 3 years ago. That's not a technicality, that's a standard of living. Now, I want to get to the part of this story that generates more frustration than almost anything else in retirement planning. What happens to your CPP when you die? Because this is where a lot of Canadians feel genuinely betrayed. You contributed to the Canada Pension Plan. From every paycheck, your employer matched those contributions. You did everything right. But if you pass away and your surviving spouse is already receiving their own maximum CPP benefit, your CPP does not transfer to them. It disappears. It goes back into the general pool. At first glance, that may seem like a technical limitation. But sit with that for a moment. In your TFSA, that money passes to your beneficiary. In your RRSP, it transfers to your spouse. In a private pension, with proper structure, provisions exist. But in the CPP, a plan you had no choice but to contribute to, the rules are different. And this is where the story changes, because CPP is not government money. It is not a social program funded by general tax revenue. It is your money, taken from your earnings, matched by your employer, invested on your behalf. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board manages over $600 billion in assets. That fund exists because of contributions from Canadian workers. So the question isn't whether this money should be inheritable. The question is why it isn't already. I've spoken with clients over the years, couples who planned carefully, where one spouse passes early and the survivor is left with less income, despite 2 lifetimes of contributions between them. That is not a system design flaw, someone accidentally overlooked. That is a structural choice, and it has consequences for real families. Now, what about the contribution rates themselves? The maximum employee contribution in 2026 is approximately $4,646. Self-employed Canadians pay both sides, employer and employee, effectively doubling that. If you're earning above $74,600, you're also contributing an additional 4% into CPP2 on income up to $85,000. Most people see this as a payroll deduction they can't control, and they're right. They can't. But understanding where that money goes and what it will actually produce for you in retirement is worth knowing precisely. The real question is what happens next. Canada's national debt is growing at a pace that would have been considered extraordinary 5 years ago. When debt expands at this rate, history suggests inflation tends to follow, not necessarily immediately. But over a 3 to 5 year horizon, the pressure builds. And if inflation does rise again, CPP adjustments will rise with it. That's the silver lining, if you want to call it that. Higher inflation means higher adjustments to your pension income, but it also means higher costs for everything you buy. The net effect, for most retirees, is close to neutral. Which brings me to the broader question I want to leave you with today. Is the Canada Pension Plan a good deal for you specifically? The answer depends almost entirely on how long you live, when you started contributing, and whether the people you love will have any access to what you built. For some Canadians, CPP is reliable, predictable income they couldn't have generated on their own. For others, especially those who die early or whose spouses are already at the benefit maximum, the math is far less favorable. That is not a reason to panic, but it is a reason to plan, to understand what CPP will realistically provide, and to build around it with tools that offer the flexibility and transferability CPP does not. Your TFSA, your RRSP, private insurance products, spousal planning, these aren't alternatives to CPP. They're the structures that fill the gaps CPP was never designed to fill. I've spent a long time watching people arrive at retirement, having assumed the government had handled more than it actually did. The best retirement plans I've seen aren't the ones that relied on CPP most. They're the ones that understood CPP clearly and planned accordingly. That's what today was about. Not anxiety, not outrage, just clarity, so you can make better decisions with the years you have ahead.